The second half of this lecture focuses on Carl Jung and his theory. He was a Swiss psychoanalyst known as a neo-psychoanalyst who is best known for his theory of analytical psychology. He brought together ideas from a variety of fields and ended up influencing a variety of fields with his own ideas. Carl Jung was born in the late 1800s in Switzerland. His entire family was full of clergymen, but he was still disappointed in his father, who he viewed as weak. He was distrustful of his mother because although he knew that she was powerful, he also thought that she was emotionally unstable. He was introverted, lonely, and isolated from other children. He avoided them and they avoided him. He made himself feel better and escaped these feelings through his dreams, his visions, and his fantasies. At the turn of the 19th century, Jung earned his medical degree and specialized in psychiatry. After graduation, he developed his own private clinical practice and started teaching at the University of Zurich. In 1906, several years after graduation, Jung began a 7-year correspondence with Sigmund Freud. At the time, in the early 1900s, Freud considered Jung to be his protege, his spiritual son. Unfortunately, in 1913, Jung disappointed Freud to the point that Freud kicked Jung out of his special private group. Here is a picture of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in 1909 at Clark University. The gentleman you see in the center is G. Stanley Hall. He invited Freud to the United States. This is the one and only time that Sigmund Freud traveled to the United States of America. One of the reasons Jung got kicked out of Freud's private group is because Jung disagreed with Freud. Freud did not like dissenters. He wanted his disciples to go along with just about everything he said. Jung did not agree with parts of Freud's theory, and for this reason, he got himself kicked out. So let's look at some of those ways that Jung's theory differs from Freud's theory. First, they disagreed on the role of sexuality. Jung broadened Freud's definition of libido by redefining it as a more generalized psychic energy that included sex but was not limited to that desire, that instinct. They also disagreed about the forces that influence psychology. Jung believed that personality is affected by what happens in both childhood and adulthood, and by what we aspire to do in the future. Make a note of this difference. This is a very important difference. They also disagreed on the topic of the unconscious. Jung probed more deeply into the unconscious and added an entirely new dimension, the inherited experiences of all humans, something he called the collective unconscious. Throughout his career, he published several influential articles and books. He traveled all over the world. He came to the United States, East Africa, India, England. He also shared his insight about Adolf Hitler's personality with the Allies in World War II. Jung's theory is focused on inner growth. He had a special term for personality. He called it the psyche. And he proposed that there are 3 different parts of the psyche: the personal conscious, the personal unconscious, and then the collective unconscious. Jung defined the libido as both a broad, generalized form of life energy and a narrower psychic energy that fuels the personality, that fuels the psyche. I wanted to show you an illustration of Jung's theory before we jump into it. So refer back to this image if you need to. Jung proposed 3 different principles to describe how psychic energy comes to be. The opposition principle suggests that psychic energy is generated by conflicts between opposing processes. The equivalence principle suggests that psychic energy comes from another part of the personality, that psychic energy can shift from one part to another part depending on the situation. The entropy principle is the tendency for the psyche to try to maintain a balance, to try to maintain equilibrium. Like Freud, Jung proposed different aspects or components of the personality. He used the term ego to describe the part of the personality that is concerned with perceiving, thinking, remembering. According to Jung, the ego is the center of the consciousness. The ego selects what gets paid attention to, what makes it into conscious awareness. The ego also channels our psychic energy internally and externally, within us and also in terms of how we behave around other people. Jung suggested there were 2 attitudes within the psyche, the personality: extraversion and introversion. This is not the first time you will hear these words. I do want you to remember that Jung was the first to introduce these ideas to our lexicon. Extraversion is an orientation toward the outer world, toward the people and events that occur outside of ourselves. It is the tendency to be open, sociable, and assertive in social situations. Introversion, on the other hand, is the orientation toward the inner world, toward one's own thoughts, perceptions, and experiences. Introverts tend to be a little bit more withdrawn and shy than extroverts. According to Jung, everyone has the capability to have both attitudes, but usually one becomes more dominant than the other. Another aspect of personality that Jung emphasized is the psychological functions of personality. These are the different and opposing ways of perceiving and judging the external and the internal world. Everyone uses all 4 of these functions, but again, one is usually dominant much of the time. Let's take a look at these functions. Perceiving functions are related to the way we receive and process information. Sensing types focus on the details, the specifics of a situation, and typically rely on the information that is available to them. Intuitive types focus more on the big picture and rely on things like intuition and unconscious information. Judging functions involve the way we make decisions. Thinking types use objective information. Feeling types tend to use more subjective information, like their feelings. If we combine the 2 attitudes and the 4 psychological functions, we get 8 psychological types. You can see them here in this table. Extroverted thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting, and then introverted thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting. Take a look at this table and pick out which one of these types you think best fits your personality. Another aspect of personality that Jung wrote extensively about is the personal unconscious. This is the reservoir for trivial or disturbing information that has been suppressed. Little effort is required to reach back in that personal unconscious and bring forward information. Large numbers of experiences are then grouped into what Jung called complexes. A complex, technically, is a pattern of emotions, memories, perceptions, and wishes that are all organized around a common theme. I'm watching a show on Netflix right now that is centered around a character with what is called a hero complex. Much of what this character does in the show is based on being a hero, saving people, helping people. Complexes can be conscious or unconscious. They can be helpful or harmful. The collective unconscious is one of the more unique aspects of Jung's theory. He suggested that all humans are born with information already in their unconscious, and this information comes from our ancestors and their shared experiences. The collective unconscious, according to Jung, is the deepest and least accessible level of the psyche. It's made up of instincts and what he called archetypes. We'll get into the archetypes in just a moment. The collective unconscious is not shaped by personal experience. It is something that is innate. You are born with it, and it is shaped by the experiences of generations past. He used this notion of the collective unconscious to explain some of the strange and unexplainable things he observed with his own patients. Sometimes patients would describe similar dreams. He could not figure out how two different people who don't know each other could have the same dreams. He proposed this idea of the collective unconscious to try to explain how two different people, possibly on different ends of the world, might have similar dreams. Finally, Jung proposed a number of archetypes. These archetypes are pre-existing images, symbols, ideas, models of universal experiences that are contained within the collective unconscious. So archetypes go with the collective unconscious. These archetypes they're not fixed because they're somewhat shaped by the culture within which a person is raised. You can see that some of these might have some overlap. For instance, death and rebirth might have some overlap. The hero and God may have some overlap for some individuals. The persona archetype is the mask we wear in public. According to Jung, everyone has a public personality and a private personality. Those personalities sometimes do not match up. The persona archetype is that personality, that public face. For instance, a person is nice to their coworkers, but then goes home and is mean to their spouse, their partner, their children, their dog. The shadow archetype contains the basic primitive animal instincts. The shadow archetype is the darker side of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. So in your dreams, you sometimes take on evil roles and do evil things. Jung suggested that these dreams are an expression of your shadow archetype. This archetype is the most powerful and it has the deepest roots to our ancient ancestors. It can be a source of evil, but it is also that part of our personality that makes us spontaneous and creative and fun to be around. Total suppression of the shadow archetype can lead to a dull and lifeless personality, according to Jung. The anima archetype contains the feminine aspects of a male's personality. A father can be very nurturing toward his children. That nurturing behavior is part of his anima archetype. The animus archetype contains the masculine aspects of the female personality. A mother can be demanding toward her children. Both archetypes represent Jung's belief that men and women can possess qualities of both genders. He suggested that healthy personalities have a little bit of both. They have feminine qualities and they have masculine qualities. The final archetype I'll mention is the self archetype. And this represents the harmony of a person's total personality. It cannot begin to emerge. The self archetype does not emerge until all the other systems of the psyche develop, which occurs in middle age. Striving toward wholeness, striving toward this harmony, then, is the ultimate goal in life, according to Jung. We feel a sense of accomplishment and a sense of peace as we learn to balance the different roles in our life. Jung believed that this wasn't possible until adulthood. I want to make a few points about Jung's beliefs regarding personality development. He believed that individuals grow throughout their lives, that we are always moving toward a more complete level of self-realization. He suggested the ego begins to develop in early childhood, and the personality of young children mimics their parents' personalities or makes up for what their parents' personalities are lacking. Then the psyche assumes a more definite form in adolescence, and the individual goes through what is called a psychic birth. This period is often marked by difficulties, conflicts, challenges. Until adulthood, the focus of an adolescent is on preparatory activities, getting ready for adult life, learning how to do the things that are required of adults. In middle age, everyone goes through another drastic change in their personality. This time it is called individuation. This process begins when older adults start to fulfill their lifelong dreams and become the individual that they've always wanted to become. To strive for individuation in middle adulthood, people have to do a number of things. They have to confront their unconscious desires and instincts. They have to dethrone the persona, that mask that they wear in public. They have to become aware of the dark side of their personality and acknowledge those aspects of who they are. And finally, they have to accept and express both the feminine and the masculine parts of their personality. These 4 bullet points describe what a middle-aged adult is expected to do in order to reach their full potential. Once these 4 criteria are met, the personality can be unified and balanced. a process that is called transcendence. Jung believed psychotic symptoms emerge when the personality cannot regulate or adapt itself. The symptoms can then be resolved by bringing the unconscious into the conscious. Jung did this. He explored the unconscious through a task that he created. It's called a word association task. It's a projective technique that asks patients to respond to a stimulus word with whatever word immediately comes to mind. I say a word, you respond as quickly as you possibly can with the first word that comes to your mind. You can see here in the table on the screen, he wrote down the responses of hysterical patients versus normal patients. In this table, you can see how someone who is considered hysterical with psychotic symptoms, how an individual with hysteria might respond to these words, and then compare it to the words that you used. Jung also used many of the methods that Freud used. He analyzed symptoms and the free associations, the words that people used to respond to stimuli. He analyzed dreams, but he believed that dreams help us prepare for future events and help bring about a balance of opposites in the psyche. So by expressing some things in our dreams, we release that energy or allow that energy to move to a different part of the personality. Jung was also a fan of the life history reconstruction, which is a technique that examines past experiences to try to identify patterns that may explain current symptoms. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI, is one of the most popular personality assessments on the planet. Part of the reason for this is because the test developers are excellent promoters of this test. Jung had no part in creating the MBTI. It is, however, based on his psychological types that we learned about earlier in the lecture. It was actually created by a mother-daughter team, Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Meyer. They identified 16 instead of 8 personality types. The MBTI is sometimes used for selection purposes. Not a good idea. There isn't enough data to back up the use of the MBTI in selection and promotion practices. It can be used for fun. It can be used to explore your personality, but it is not a legally defensible selection tool. Strengths of Jung's theory. His word association test became a standard projective technique and inspired the development of the Rorschach ink blot test and lie detection techniques decades later. His concepts of extraversion, introversion, and complexes are widely accepted and studied today. He was the first to emphasize the role of the future in determining our personality development and our behavior. His notion of a midlife crisis is also supported by a considerable amount of research, longitudinal research. However, Jung's theory, like all the other theories that we'll talk about in this class, suffers from a few criticisms. Like Freud, his methods were subjective and he did not collect information in a standardized way. Some of his concepts were difficult to understand, and his writings were often inconsistent and lacked systemization. Sometimes he used different words to describe the same concept. Research does not support the existence of 16 distinct personality types, but to be fair, Jung originally came up with 8 types. It was the originators of the MBTI that came up with the 16 different aspects of personality. Unfortunately, those 16 aspects are associated with Jung. Finally, one of the greatest weaknesses of Jung's theory is his discussion of the supernatural. His ideas were heavily influenced by spirituality, theology. It was important to him to consider a variety of different ideas and incorporate those ideas into his theory. But those ideas made it difficult for traditional scholars and researchers to jump on board with his theory. That is all for the week 2 lecture. I will see you in week 3.